This week's article of the week is Tuskegee Airmen by Jessica McBurney. The subtitle says the Tuskegee Airmen were a group of African American fighter pilots and bomber pilots, including their support crew who flew for the U.S. Army Air Forces in World War II. Despite facing racial discrimination, their missions were some of the most successful in the American military. As you read, identify the challenges faced by the Tuskegee Airmen, and then analyze the impact that this group had on the civil rights movement. So as we're going through this, let's make sure we look for and identify the challenges faced by the Tuskegee Airmen, and then make sure that we can also connect what they did to the impact they had on the civil rights movement. Let's begin. Our first paragraph is numbered, but we need to remember that we're going to number the rest of the paragraphs as well. So paragraph number 1. When most people think of the civil rights movement and the end of legalized segregation in the U.S., they think of the 1960s. However, the movement did not start then, and it was not confined to the streets and diners in the South. One of the earliest successes for racial equality actually occurred in the 1940s in the U.S. military, thanks to the hard work of a group known as the Tuskegee Airmen. To the right, you'll see a picture here. It says 8 Tuskegee Airmen in front of a P-40 fighter aircraft. That is our caption for the picture. Remember, a caption tells us more information about pictures. Our first subheading, Tuskegee Airmen, an early civil rights success. Notice too that civil rights movement, and civil rights in this situation, those are both capitalized, okay? Our vocabulary that we did on our word boxes, that was lowercase because generally civil rights we're talking about freedoms. But in this case, we were talking about the civil rights movement, a specific movement about people of color, racial segregation, and their freedoms and rights that they did not have during this time. So again, just notice that that was capitalized. The Tuskegee Airmen were a group of African American fighter pilots and bomber pilots, including their support crew, who trained at the Tuskegee airfields in Alabama during World War II. They became the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bombardment Group. Notice there's a small number 1 there. That means that we need to check the footnote at the bottom of the page. In the U.S. Army Air Forces at the height of the war, and their missions were some of the most successful in the American military. During World War I, several decades earlier, African Americans were denied the ability to become fighter pilots and help the war effort. This sparked a growing controversy in the African American community. In April of 1939, after a 20-year battle, Congress finally allocated funds to set up a special division to train African American pilots to fly fighter planes. Most people were highly skeptical of the new unit. Racism was still very present in and out of the military, and many Army officials did not believe African Americans had the skills or the intelligence to learn everything a pilot needs to know. Notice at the bottom of the page, there's our footnote. It says a bombardment group or bomb group was a group of bomber aircraft with the United States Army Air Forces during World War II. We need to make sure we go back and circle the word that goes with our footnote. Next subheading. Don't forget what we're supposed to do with our subheadings. Over 400 African Americans enlisted to be in the new division. The entrance requirements were very strict, including high experience requirements and a series of IQ and other intelligence tests. Because of discriminatory policies in the Army, notice there's a footnote, all the officers in charge of the new recruits were white. The practical training took place at the Tuskegee airfields in Alabama, and the trainees also took courses at Tuskegee University nearby. They quickly proved their personal drive to learn and their new skills as pilots. This proficiency, another footnote, struck blows at previous race-based policies in the military. They soon needed to undergo highly advanced training that African Americans had previously been barred from receiving. The Tuskegee Air Program gained national attention when First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt paid them a visit in 1941. She rode as a passenger of Pilot C. Alfred Chief Anderson, who had become an unofficial leader and tutor in the group because of his skills. After the trip, she remarked, "Well, you can fly all right." Next subheading, Combat Ready. By 1943, in the middle of the U.S.'s involvement in World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen were ready for combat. In one of their earliest missions, a group was assigned to attack a strategically located island in the Mediterranean Sea near Italy. They successfully got over 1,000 Italian troops to surrender and were instrumental, another footnote, in the capture of the island. In later assignments, they became most famous for their ability to escort larger bomber planes. The airmen became known as Red Tails, or red-tailed angels, because of the distinctive red markings on the tails of their small fighter planes. Soon, the sight of a swarm of red-tailed escort planes kept enemy fighters from trying to attack the bomber planes they protected. The 332nd Fighter Group became one of the most successful squadrons of fighter planes in the Army. For example, in March of 1945, they destroyed 3 German fighter jets and damaged 5 more without losing any of their own planes to the enemy. Subheading, Continuing Racism. And remember, that's one of our words we need to know. The 477th Bombardment Group faced more challenges, as one of their early commanders was an overt racial segregationist. There's a footnote there. The pilots wanted to be treated as well as their white counterparts, which included having access to an officers' club on their training base in Michigan. Their commander would not allow them to enter. Notice here's all of our footnotes, okay? So we need to go back and make sure we circle those words. After 2 transfers to 2 different states and continuing discrimination, a large group of pilots forced their way into an officers' club in Indiana, and over 100 of them were arrested for disobeying orders. The charges were soon dropped because they were so unfair, but the events demonstrated the severe racism African American military personnel continued to face even though they were so successful. Subheading, Legacy and the End of Segregation. At the end of World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen were well known for being some of the best pilots in the military. The escort groups had among the lowest loss records in the Army Air Forces. Their success was due to their extensive pre-war experience and their personal strength and drive during training and combat. In the years after the war, the U.S. Air Force became a separate entity from the Army, but many of its white squadrons were at least somewhat underqualified for the tasks they needed to perform. However, they could not hire any experienced black airmen because of the segregation policies. This eventually led President Truman to sign Executive Order 9981 in 1948, which called for equal treatment policies and effectively ended segregation in the military. This was one of the earliest steps to ending segregation across the country. It would not have been possible without the hard work and expertise of the Tuskegee Airmen. Remember to go back and complete those annotations that are listed at the bottom of your page. Our questions. We actually have 6 questions. The first 2 need to be completed in sentences using evidence from the text, okay? Make sure you identify the paragraphs where you found the information to help you with your responses. Question number 1, the Tuskegee Airmen chose to fight in World War II for the United States, even though they were treated like second-class citizens in their own country. What do you think motivated these pilots? So find some of the evidence that was within the article about their motivation and what made them want to do that job, even though they were treated like second-class citizens. Number 2, according to the article, the military was essentially desegregated by the end of World War II, yet still today some combat roles in the military are not open to women. Do you think this is an example of discrimination? Why or why not? So think about that, okay? And really be thoughtful in your answer there. We've talked about a few of these things in class. The rest of the questions are multiple choice. Make sure that you look at the key words in each one of those questions to help you answer them, and then identify the paragraph that helped you answer those questions. Take your time, go back, and reread. This is not due until next Thursday.